It's the F-bomb of politics, the rhetorical nuclear option. Succeed in attaching this label to your opponent, and it'll cast instant doubt on their very humanity.
Fascism. You're a fascist for believing that.
He's a fascist.
Fucking fascist!
But what is fascism? What separates it from the other deadly isms? And is there a new growth of fascism happening in this new century? Seems like the concept of fascism is everywhere these days. In Europe, fledgling nationalist movements are on the rise. And in America, radical groups like Antifa have sprung up to combat what they consider to be fascist tendencies on the political right. Both sides display a tendency towards violence and authoritarianism to advance their ends. But when the word fascism gets thrown around so much, it's hard to know what it really means.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
George Orwell made this point in 1944, writing that the word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. Almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascism. Defining fascism precisely is a tricky thing. Because of its populist nature, it differs in every country where it's applied. Here's how the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini described his vision of the fascist state. The citizen in the fascist state is no longer a selfish individual who has the antisocial right of rebelling against any law of the collectivity. In contrast, the Nazi tyrant Adolf Hitler's definition put more emphasis on the state's control of private property. The state should retain supervision, and each property owner should consider himself appointed by the state. It is his duty not to use his property against the interests of others among his own people. This is the crucial matter. The Third Reich will always retain its right to control the owners of property. Unlike the other isms, fascism sprang not from a consistent ideology, but rather as an opportunistic play on the emotions of the people. And this explains why it's so difficult to pin down. Alluding to this, Mussolini was known to quip that he himself was the definition of fascism.
So one key thing about Mussolini was the fact that he was a mastermind of the language. He could talk in the same language people talk. He could make an impression upon them by speaking in a simple, accessible way. He knew which chords he needed to play in order to get into, the collective mind, so to say.
Is the resurgence of fascism a threat we should take seriously? Or is it just a relic of the 20th century, only applicable to textbooks and history lessons? To answer this question, we need to look at what exactly fascism is and where it came from. Today, Europe is rife with fascist movements stretching across a dozen countries. What unites these movements under a single term is the way they appeal to populist impulse using the idea of national mythology and the creation of an enemy against which to rally popular unrest. For example, in Italy, the birthplace of fascism, Mussolini tapped into popular support by hearkening back to the glory days of the Roman Empire.
Nationalism is always about a mythical past. And Mussolini's mythical past was the Roman Empire. So the empire he established, the empire he tried to establish, was to be some sort of a Roman Empire reloaded. That was preposterous. Italy was never going to rule the world, but it was enough to keep up with the fantasy of the people.
By promising a return to a mythologized past, he was able to rally his people, direct corporate activity towards the national interest, and set up non-Italians as a scapegoat for all of the country's domestic problems. Yet for all of his talk about strength and national pride, Mussolini was at times chillingly frank about his goals. The fascist state organizes the nation, but leaves a sufficient margin of liberty to the individual. The latter is deprived of all useless and possibly harmful freedom, but retains what is essential. The deciding power in this question cannot be the individual, but the state alone. In Germany, Adolf Hitler took these ideas even further, implementing fascism in its most extreme form.
Und in diesen 13 Jahren haben sie auf allen Gebieten jammervoll versagt.
Hitler was obsessed with the myth of the Aryan race and the strength and militarism of Teutonic mythology. For a scapegoat, he chose the Jewish people, with horrific consequences. The problem with manufacturing an enemy to consolidate power is that you have to keep coming up with new bogeymen. Mussolini initially targeted his political opponents, but as Italy's economic and military problems worsened, he was forced to export violence to Africa, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and eventually even turning on his own people, adopting the German version of anti-Semitism under pressure from his ally, Hitler. This need to keep the masses afraid and motivated stems from the fact that fascism is a fundamentally reactionary movement. Before the 20th century, most of Europe was ruled by unelected monarchs who could govern however they pleased. With democracy, however, it became necessary to exploit popular sentiment in order to gain power. And since fascism's economic nationalism inevitably leads to negative consequences for those under its rule, leaders have to resort to greater and greater extremes. Mussolini drove Italy's economy into the ground, indulged in mass murder abroad, and got Italy into a losing war, all in a desperate attempt to remain in control.
L'artigianato che documenterà al mondo.
When he was finally deposed, the citizens of Italy strung him upside down and kicked and beat him to death. The charismatic leader who had promised them eternal glory was reduced to an unrecognizable pulp at the hands of those he had duped.